my esteemed painting instructor had a show there. And it's in a beautiful park, so you can make a day of it and have a picnic in the park and check it out. It's a really wonderful contemporary art gallery. I was just talking to my students in the professional development class, and to apply to be eligible for a BC Arts Council Visual Arts Project Grant, you have to show in public space, and the Surrey Art Gallery is an example of one of the great photo spaces we have here in British Columbia. So Jordan has also organized exhibitions and projects for the Vancouver Art Gallery, Presentation House Gallery, Kamloops Art Gallery, and Republic Gallery, among other venues. He is currently working on a book about contemporary art in the city, with a particular emphasis on Vancouver and its regional art production from 1986 to the present. So, sounds very interesting. Yes, I'm happy to have you talk about this book. So
Thank you,
welcome.
Wendy. Thanks for the invitation. Well, I'm really thrilled to be here. I haven't actually been to the school before here, and I know lots about it, and I've worked with students, graduates, and from the program, so I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you so much for coming out. And let's see if my cell phone doesn't interfere too much. Maybe if somebody, let's see. I'm trying to time my talk so I can keep track of it. Let's see if this works. So today I'm going to talk a little bit, it's a bit unusual for me. I mean, I'm going to be talking about my curatorial work. I'm used to talking about other artists' work and larger sort of subjects. And so this is a little bit more personal in some ways, and kind of looking at some of my past work. But mainly the talk is going to be about the Surrey Art Gallery and some of the programming that we've been developing there. But I thought that in preparation for the talk, something's sending data. Let's see. Maybe I'll turn this up. You can time, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Maybe give me a 10-minute warning. If this is presumably the cell phone that's giving that sound. So,
You have to turn it off because every few seconds it searches for internet.
yeah. Well, hopefully it's off now. Let's see. So, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these threads that run through my curatorial work. It's going to be a lot about talking about other artists' work artists who I've worked with, but also talking about how often people ask me, well, how do you become a curator? Why did you become a curator? What does a curator do? And so, in some ways, it's a little bit about how I came to be a curator, and hopefully, it's not something that is. It's a bit of a personal story, but it's also a chance to talk about some of the ideas and processes that go into curating. And for me, it was a strange sort of swerve away from where I thought I was going to be going. So a lot of what my work has been based on came out of some experience that I had back in the 1990s. I was a bit in transition, and I was sort of working in the art world, and as more of a participant, as an audience member in Vancouver in the early mid-90s. So it'll be a little bit about that. So the title of the talk, Printed Matter, the Street and the Backwater, in quotes, it sort of captures a couple of these threads, 3 of these threads. So as the title suggests, printed matter is referring to books, word publishing, literary practices. For me, was a very important part of how I came to art. And then the city also was something as a sort of larger concept. What is a city? What makes for urban experiences of various sorts? Was something that I was trying to think about, and I was sort of focusing on that through my academic studies, but also thinking about that a lot in relation to just my lived experience in Vancouver through the 80s and 90s. And for me, I sort of entered art through that sort of searching process. So for me, a sort of formative experience was in the sort of mid-90s coming across a literary group, actually. It wasn't so much I was going to artist-run centers, but for me, a real revelation was the Cooney School of Writing, which was a school that's still on and off again operating. Perhaps some of you are aware of it. It's a collective of writers coming from Nelson, the original Cooney School of Writing, which was closed down, and these writers came and set up a kind of quasi-institutional organization of writers, of poets mainly, but certainly some fiction and critics, fiction writers and critics. But for me, it was a real, it kind of was a community that was engaged with critical practice and ideas that was apart from the academy. So they really engaged with things like philosophy and critical theory and things that I was interested in, but situated within the city life of the city, the urban life of the city and everything that was going on there. So in terms of issues around housing, issues around gender, around class, around the sort of social milieu of Vancouver, primarily. So it was a kind of ironic institution in many ways, and for me, in particular, somebody who was a big influence on me early on was Lisa Robertson, who ran a bookstore called Proprioception Books, which was in the sort of Victory Square area. And I was a bit lost at the time. I was interested in ideas and in writing, and would go to the bookstore because there was regular readings going on there by artists, by writers, by thinkers, and it was just this milieu that I just was hungry for in terms of my own interests. And what I found there was just a really intense dialogue. It was really revelatory for me. It was a mix of poets, artists, filmmakers, critics, musicians, small press publishers, fiercely into ideas, debate, and parties with a wicked sense of humor. Many people were really quite performative and were playing these different roles in this group. So it was, for me, it was a kind of it showed that there was these practices were happening in this relatively small sort of outpost on the edge of Empire, in the sense of Vancouver, this sort of fort town. And one of the aspects of that was publishing, and Boo Magazine was an incredible space. And so again, printed matter, the book, the magazine as a kind of form for exhibition featuring artists and writers. And what you had poets writing about art, you had artists writing about poetry in this very cheap, fast and ready, kind of the cheapest sort of publication you could come by, but it was free, you just pick it up, and it was, you always read it because you could see the kind of intense kind of debate but thoughtful, not just a kind of catty sort of mudslinging. They were quite thoughtful pieces, but for myself and for others, I think we were excited by the kind of literary journalism that was going on. It was a bit fast and loose, yet it was still sort of engaged with philosophy, art history, and other things. And as I sort of participated in the Cooney School of Writing as a kind of audience member and sort of wrote on my own, I started to become involved with Rattle Moon, which is a poetry book, a magazine that perhaps some of you are familiar with, which started actually in Victoria, at the University of Victoria, but that moved to Vancouver, I think in the early 90s maybe, or late 80s. Anyway, it was a feminist poetry journal. It continued to have that right to its end at issue 20. It was edited for the most part by Susan Clark. Perhaps some of you know Susan. And it was also an intense place of crossover between poetry and visual arts. And that experience really, again, like the Cooney School of Writing, showed me that really serious art making could be happening in Western Canada. You didn't have to go to New York. You didn't have to go to London. It was being made there. And writers from all over the world, some of the really outstanding poets of the 80s and 90s were contributing writing to this magazine because there was such a strong editorial integrity to it. So that was an important kind of moment for me, and I think for others. So I sort of took some time off, and I was really resisting trying to go to art school, and I became quite interested in communications as a kind of space in the academy where you could kind of combine different college. I did my undergrad in geography, which was a very kind of humanities, very big focus, and I was frustrated by the kind of very focused inflexibility of some things that were going on in the English department, art history, and for me, communications and geography was a space where I could study art, but also ideas. And I was also inspired by curators like Monica Quindiano and Nancy Shaw, who had come through communications and really had a distinct, they were curators, they had a distinct vision about art and visual culture. Soon after that, in 2003, I was invited by a friend of mine who I met at Emily Carr when I was doing night courses in the 90s to curate a corridor space in Main Street, a little gallery called the Zeno Gallery. And it was in the back of a store which sold various handmade goods from local designers, including the owners of the store. And it was my first chance to really curate at that point. So that was, for me, and I didn't want to treat it as just a white cube. I wanted to treat it as a sort of very specific space. And I became quite interested in the idea of the corridor as a kind of transitional space, and was inviting artists to create work that responded to this space of transfer, this non-room in a way, this kind of conduit corridor space. So here's the first image was Osvaldo Hierro installed a light box in the ceiling. Antonia Hirsch created a small projection, rear projected film that was just a couple inches high, so down low. So you would hear this very sort of deep bass of a sort of soundtrack. And it was very much about the idea of, well, string theory, but also the idea of the computer and a sort of very much about time and the body. It was actually an image of her skipping, sort of slowed down, but it was a very kind of corporeal art piece, very minimal but quite lovely. And people would come into the room and sort of find it eventually, in some cases not, sort of tucked in the corner. So this is just an image of, so the owners of the store, Mohammed Salami and Ignacio Corral, they were both artists, and they were creating things like t-shirts, and it was a kind of interesting hybrid space because it was sort of a commercial space where the profits went into kind of art production. And so it became a kind of platform for performance art and other things. And you see in the background is an image of me. This is from a newspaper article. It's not a great image. But the corridor is behind me, the Zeno Gallery space. So everything was on casters, so at night they would wheel them away and have art parties. So it was outside of the artist-run nonprofit model, and it wasn't quite in the kind of for-profit white cube gallery space that you would find on South Granville. It was a part of a whole wave of new spaces that were happening in the city. I wrote down a couple names of them. For example, the Butcher Shop on Main Street, which was a kind of studio space / gallery venue. The Anodyne on Granville Entertainment District was a small gallery that was kind of a hybrid of a private and kind of non-profit space. The Crying Room in the downtown east side, Antisocial, which was a skateboard shop and a gallery space on Main Street. St. George Marsh, which was a kind of corner store / gallery, and others.
Are any of them still in existence?
No. CSA is still in existence. But I also have on my list here because the Ministry of Casual Living in Victoria, like a little bit like these kind of spaces where they're trying to really kind of rethink what a gallery space is and create a kind of parallel venue. I mean, we see these in all sorts of different cities. And I was going to bring some examples from a recent trip I made to Oakland, and sort of similar types of spaces and quite exciting new examples that are going on there. But I don't have that because my hard drive crashed recently, and all those images are kind of in limbo. But here's an image of Attila Lukács and Joe Sarahan at the gallery, and there was a documentary being made about Attila. But you see what he did is installed surfboards that he had painted. One of them, this sort of skull, kind of related to the Holbein image of the ambassadors with the anamorphic skull. The walls were lined with mirrors, so there was this, the surfboard sort of spun. And so it was a kind of use of this space, and he had fun sort of using this kind of somewhat unusual space. And then it was named after Jake, who was a surfer that he met in Hawaii and became kind of a muse for Attila. So what he did is rented a limousine, and Jake, the surfer, you could climb into the limousine and go for a ride with Jake as he went around the walk. This is just to show you, I mean, it's a small space. Sometimes there were more conventional shows of just a picture. This is a large sort of photograph, but how, you know, it was really, we made profits through kind of throwing art parties and performances. And the performance was really central. Also, we used the window vitrine as a kind of playful space for performance. We had many different performers do things there in the evening, so it became a space where you could watch the performance through the window. So here's Irene Laughlin and Joel Siona, two different performances in the vitrine. Irene's performance, I'll just mention, is sort of related to Tommy, the movie. And she bandaged her eyes shut and ate hot dogs, consumed them throughout the whole course of the night, and slept under this pinball machine that we had borrowed from the pinball rental collector from around the corner. So really we did a lot of kind of partnerships with people in the neighborhood, and it was very much about a sort of performance, a lot of live types of things. Here's Nafus Ramirez Figaro performance that he did, where the audiences were encouraged to kind of engage with him through the storefront window. So this was more of after sort of finally kind of giving in and going and doing a kind of more formal art degree, curatorial studies program, I became quite interested in, I had been doing some work around film, and particularly experimental film or art film, and particularly structuralist sort of films from the 60s and 70s. And I was interested in the relationship between visual art, photography, and the sort of film world, and how there had kind of been a schism in the 70s where they were quite united. At the show, there were shows at the Vancouver Art Gallery where you would go and see these art films beside paintings and other things. And then as the 80s came around, that was kind of bifurcated, and there's this strange separation. There's a whole political economy to that I was quite interested in studying. So this project, Infrastructural Image, Urban Projections from the Bay Area and Vancouver, was a response to an exhibition that you may have seen called Baja to Vancouver, which was about West Coast art, and it was a series of artists from Vancouver, Seattle, San Francisco, I think Portland also, Portland, San Francisco, LA, and Tijuana. But I was looking at here video artists and camera-based, lens-based practices, in a sense, and thinking about the continuities between the gallery and the cinema. So what you can kind of make out there on the sort of far right beside the doors is a camera obscura that an artist had built where you could watch sort of activities going on as a kind of film strip. There were multiple lenses, so we kind of created a sort of film strip effect of the streets outside. So it's very much about urban space and thinking about sort of proto-cinematic practices, and there's a whole history. You see artists like Rodney Graham and others who are engaged with kind of optical, early 19th century optics and sort of proto-cinema in their practices. So some of that was examined here. It was also a response to, I was curious about how in the Vancouver art scene there was quite a lot of chatter about sort of comparing Vancouver to LA, and I became quite interested in that because from my reading, there was this whole interesting relationship to San Francisco, and so what I sort of investigated with this show was looking at these real historical ties. People like Anna Banana and artists from the Western Front went back and forth to San Francisco, as artists did from Victoria. But it was trying to kind of sort of brush against the grain and read kind of West Coast through these two cities, where the view was so central. The concept of the view and the idea of kind of the picturesque and about sort of a kind of narcissistic image of its own sort of downtown, sort of looking outward but also looking in, and these sort of parallels between San Francisco and Vancouver. Even though Vancouver is the same age as Los Angeles, there's a lot more parallels in terms of the topography, the interest in panoramic photography and film in terms of art practice. So Jim Campbell's a Bay Area artist who works a lot with sort of digital media. Rebecca Bollinger is another artist who works a lot between sort of photography and cinema. Michael Dam had done a sort of piece about the main street of Oakland, that bottom image where he blocked out most of, he was sort of a drive-by of, I can't remember the name of the street, it's the main street in Oakland, which was an absolute disaster in the 90s. It sort of had kind of really fallen into this bad times, and he was interested in how to image this, how to picture this space, because he was kind of responding to the critiques of artists portraying poverty and portraying making a spectacle out of poverty, and so what he had done is sort of blocked out most of the image, but you can still see aspects of the city street. Above is Adam Harrison, sort of looking at, he sort of used film and responding to kind of street photographic traditions, American traditions, but using a film loop of, it was a laundromat with a washing machine where you could see people on the street through the lens, like a circle of the glass window in the washing machine. And Jamie Delinko had done a number of works about sort of voyeurism in the West End and photographing various scenarios in sort of West End apartments, and very much about a kind of these notions of looking and voyeurism in the city, and pairing that with somebody like Ernie Gare, who's very well known around in terms of experimental film, where he created a kind of film where he set up the camera and it went up and down a kind of famous hotel glass elevator in San Francisco to kind of create these slices of the city. So the city keeps on coming back in my work in different ways, but around that time I had also been involved in a publication, so back to the role of the writing and the word, and a group of us came together in 2003, a bunch of artists and curators and writers, and we were kind of mutually frustrated with the fact that there was no kind of place to write about art exhibitions or to practice kind of criticism. And we were inspired by Boo magazine and Vanguard magazine in the 80s that had been venues that local writers could practice, and not just art critics, but artists could write about other artists' work. And so some of us went on, others, different groups kind of broke off. There was Doppelganger, which was an online publication that lasted for a few years. But Philip started as a broadsheet. You see on the left, it was kind of like a newspaper, again inspired by kind of a very cheap sort of format. And then it developed into kind of more of a journal there. Oops. So some of the things that inspired us have been, as I said, Vanguard, but also Parachute, and the Montreal Journal was also a big inspiration for us. Inventory, which is from London. And I mean, it was, in some ways, we were kind of responding to a kind of sort of quick and ready sort of a certain type of art journalism, which we had noticed in terms of the Canadian art press scene, and Lola, although Lola had some great fun writing, but it was a very sort of short form, very kind of, oftentimes very kind of malicious type of, and quite, in some ways, very sloppy sort of art writing, and it was a good gossip rag, and, which is nothing wrong. I mean, we loved magazines like Caligula from LA, which was a very much kind of gossip rag in the art scene. But what we wanted to do is create a place for long-form writing. What does this have to do with curating? For me, it was, and for us, we all kind of had curatorial practices. Some of us had art practices as well. But Philip was also a space for art projects. Philip was a play on the sort of first-person name of all these magazines like Lola and others. But Philip also means a kind of insert or add-on, kind of. It's the thing to sweeten the deal, and for us it was, we commissioned different art projects, posters, and other paper-based kind of additions to go into the publication. There you see the Vancouver Vancouver Public Library kind of stitched together with a Ricardo Bofill, a kind of postmodernist building in Europe at the time. And so these artists are quite interested in architectural related practices. It was also a space to invite artists and curators and critics to talk about visual art practices and larger visual culture, and the politics of image making and writing and critical practices. So that was also very important in terms of what I was doing in terms of curating and connecting in with a larger kind of art circuit and discourse around contemporary art. So going to things like the New York Art Book Fair. In its early days, it was in the Dia Art Center, the old Dia Art Center space in Chelsea. And what it opened up for me, because I had not traveled that much in terms of the art scene, I wasn't particularly flush with money in the 1990s, and so for me it kind of opened up a world of this incredible version of publishing and art, and so this incredible variety of artists working with the published medium, with sort of tangible objects, was incredibly inspiring. I had done some work at the Vancouver Art Gallery. I kind of been working on and off at the art gallery since the mid-1990s, and I had been invited to do a guest curated project there, responding to the front facade of the gallery. And so I worked with an artist who I'd worked with at the Zeno Gallery, Jeff Lavisher, who's works a lot with hand-drawn on paper, ink on paper. And we had sort of talked about this space of the portico of the gallery and its longer history in terms of its relationship to the courthouse. So he had done some preparatory sketches. His work is very much about this sort of tradition within a kind of comic and animation tradition of where the body becomes this kind of very malleable kind of, kind of a punching bag. So he kind of, and this interest in the hobo as a kind of protagonist in early animation and comics, and so this sort of figure of the hobo or the sort of schmuck who kind of is constantly getting smacked around by society sort of turns up in his work. And so what he came up with is this sort of character in kind of enmeshed in this sort of facade of the columns at the art gallery. So it was, here we have it inflated and did I show the image? There you see a kind of bottom-up sketch of how it, because of the issues of wind and other things, how we kind of resolve trying to secure this inflatable work. And there it is. I know. Because it's quite a serious space. It was kind of, it sort of had a kind of, in a way, a kind of tragic-comic aspect to it. This space is also, as you probably know, it's a space of a gathering, not just in terms of for protest or for lunch, consuming your lunch or taking your break if you're a courier. It's also a space where you go and smoke pot, do other things, illicit things, and it's a bit of a space where street kids gather or various people kind of go, and it's ironic because it used to be the kind of main entrance before Arthur Erickson redesigned it and blocked it off to the old courthouse, but it's also one of these spaces where you can go and kind of not, you can do things that you wouldn't want the authorities to see. But it's also been a real lightning rod for sort of people making statements, political statements, and so we're kind of looking at the history of how back in the 60s, a lot of people would gather there to hang out, play music, and various other things. And the mayor at the time, Tom Campbell, mayor of Vancouver, there was some amazing sort of statements that he would make on the sort of front plaza of the Vancouver Art, not the Vancouver Art Gallery, but the courthouse at the time, about hippies and general louts and layabouts, and he had some great sort of quotes and moments, very high publicity moments where he kind of grandstanded about hippie culture and homeless, people who were just laying about on the street. And in a way, this was kind of thinking about how, at the time, there was a real campaign against panhandlers and people who were just, operating on the street in unconventional ways, and we sort of kind of saw this link between that moment and that earlier moment. And I've been very interested in Vancouver art history and also BC art history, and I had a chance to come over to Victoria when I was researching. I was a lead researcher on this exhibition that you may have seen called Traffic that toured across the country. And it was looking at, conceptual art, but it wasn't just purely conceptual art. It included fluxus, performance art, in many ways, many practices that were going on in the 60s and 70s. So I had a chance to go to the ExhibitVic's archive in the, up in the attic of that great building, and dig through the archives of what was going on in Victoria, and going to open space and rummaging around in the archive boxes and learning a lot about the history of BC art and just the incredible riches of things that have gone on that have been kind of left out of the histories of this place. And I think for me it just reinforced how much, there's so much that has gone on here in Western Canada that we don't, that is just fuel for future projects, and that there's so much here, and I think that for me, I made a decision rather than moving to one of the major art cities like Berlin. A lot of Canadian artists have gone to Berlin, and curators. I just felt like I kind of decided I'm going to sort of work here and try to develop projects here as a curator. I just thought that there was just so much interesting stuff to build on, and to create a magazine that has now become quite successful as a magazine. I stopped co-editing it a number of years ago now. For example, Michael Goldberg's Room on Its Side, which is this incredible project from 1971, where he created a kind of upside-down room with using video cameras and delay so that you would walk around the space and then sort of see an image of yourself walking into the room. But it was very much about the FLQ crisis and things that were going on in Canada at the time. And Michael's been largely forgotten, about in Western Canada and art world. He now lives in Japan. And it was just one of many works. Showroom was a project that I was involved with. A couple, Christina Podesva, and she was an artist and co-editor of Philip, and Ingrid Bolker, who's an architect, created a kind of response to. We're quite curious about the condo showroom as a kind of exhibition space, and about the kind of real estate transformations that were going on in Vancouver and continue to go on there. So artists responded. They invited a number of artists and curators to create works around the space of this sort of half-finished showroom. It was kind of a part construction site, so you have the kind of kitchen countertops kind of set up as a kind of showroom. That orange mesh kind of barricade around the tree that you see around the city was hand-knitted by Heidi Nightengale. You see inside the kind of space, it became a kind of platform to have debates and conversations about real estate and art. I worked on this project. I don't have great pictures of it, but on the left-hand side, it was this tower made out of scaffolding that we turned into a kind of, also a projection site, and we invited artists, Marianne Bose, Paul de Guzman, Vanessa Kwan, and Alex Pensato to create different artworks around the idea of the view and how the view was represented in magazines. So one of the artists looked at old Vancouver magazines and the sort of language and imagery around the view. There's just some of the, and one of the other artists went out and sort of looked at hoardings and images, and another one looked at the web and sort of new internet sort of forms of marketing. Anyway, it was one of many projects that happened as part of Showroom. This for me was I did a little bit of work at the Presentation House Gallery, which I'm a huge fan of, and I've always really admired what had been done there. Karen Love in the 80s had really single-handedly kind of created this incredible gallery, and future curators and directors sort of took it from there. But it was also a lesson for me in terms of thinking about the public in a deeper way. I had to think about audience in different ways at the database, gallery space, and I don't have time to go into that so much, but I was invited to do a summer blockbuster on dogs and contemporary art. So co-curated this, and we brought in Joe Longhurst, who had done a lot of work around whippets, and sort of other artists who had done work around pit bulls and various breeds, and we looked at older archival imagery. I think we have some here, tin pipes, and of course Winnie Wegman. It was interesting because it was just trying to think. Initially, I was really kind of just concerned about, I think, some of the sort of looseness in terms of the curatorial aim of it. I was coming out of kind of curatorial school, and I just thought this was light and fluffy and really kind of not really what I wanted to do. But it became quite fun, and creating a kind of dialogue around a kind of entree into what contemporary artists were doing through this thing. And it was incredible to me because I was like on Fanny Kiefer, on breakfast television with dogs, like the media just lit up, like they'd never called us for anything else, and then all of a sudden, oh, you're doing a dog show? Okay, Fanny Kiefer wants you on. And so it was this bizarre, I don't know what it's like in Victoria, but the Vancouver media is very fickle, and I'll maybe talk about that in relation to the Surrey Art Gallery and various relationships, but there's, you just don't, the French-Canadian media will call us up when I was at the Presentation House Gallery or other galleries that I've been at every show. Wow, that sounds fascinating. You're doing an exhibition about any subject. You know, Radio Canada was right there. Not Anglo-Canada radio. Dogs maybe will show up.
Sounds very similar to it.
Yeah. So, moving along, I also became interested in the relationship between design and art, and artists who are doing work around notions of decor and interior design. And so this is an exhibition in a private gallery space this time. I was invited to curate an exhibition, and I don't have time to go into it so much, but the wallpaper piece by Yeda Morrison, she's a San Francisco artist who works around the extinct varieties of plants and created a series of wallpapers around that. And there's lots of other work there. The piece I want to just show you, because for me it was a really important piece. It was responding again to the kind of politics of space and redevelopment in the city. This gallery is in Stan Douglas's old studio, which is above what was an old record store, which is Scratch Records, and it's right in the heart of this incredible transformation of redevelopment down by the library. And so buildings were being dropped left and right around the time of this exhibition, and Erica Stocking created a piece kind of responding to that by taking some of the debris, the broken glass from different construction sites on both sides of the gallery. And in the kind of vaulted ceiling, which had a skylight, she created a false ceiling and embedded these glass shards in the roof, and it was quite a beautiful, moving piece, sort of responding to site. So this idea of site, what's called in art speak, site specificity, this sort of location and the importance of context has always really interested me in terms of curatorial work. I'm not going to talk about so much of the Kamloops Art Gallery, although for me the Kamloops Art Gallery was always a really a fascinating place working for Vancouver, because they had a great program. There had been some wonderful curators and artists who had shown there. They also had a really good publishing program. And for me, Kamloops was this kind of exotic place that I'd only been to a couple times before, with this deeper history as an older city. And so working there was a chance to engage with other kind of currents and other histories. And one of the projects that really left an impression for me and really inspired my work at the time was a project that happened in the old courthouse in Kamloops, which has such a spotty and deep history and so many different important court cases and legal battles have happened there. And this was Adrian Stimpson and Laurie Blondeau. They did this sort of photo project where they would dress up in these characters, Belle Sauvage and Buffalo Boy, and invite participants to come and dress up in different costumes, from older costumes of various sorts. And it was done at the Western Front. I'm not sure, did it ever come to Victoria? Open Space ever do something with these? No. They toured it across the country. It was a very important project, and they've since kind of put it to bed. But
So was it a performance?
yeah, so people would come and get dressed up, and they would sort of perform it. It was, I mean, in many ways, it makes me think all the time of the Victoria photo.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
What is that?
old-time photo.
Yeah. So you get dressed up in Western clothes and enact cowboys and Indians, and so they were really kind of trying to subvert this kind of tourism of a kind of nostalgia for these relationships, but also kind of playfulness within their critique. But in the old courthouse, it was just breathtaking and really cool.
Great Kamloops.
Yeah. I kind of threw this in. This is kind of a little bit up. But Wendy asked me to talk about sort of larger curatorial things, and I was just sort of thinking of other curators who, for me, were kind of role models and inspirations. These are just a few here in the Canadian kind of scene. But for me, Keith Wallace, who is now a kind of acting director at the Belkin, the old UBC Fine Art Gallery, now the Morrison Hill and Belkin Art Gallery. And for me, he was really critical in terms of bringing artists from outside, from Asia and from Latin America, you know, in the days before it really became trendy to kind of bring artists in from China or Latin America. I mean, he was really actively trying to shake up the discourse and the kind of art scene that was going on in Vancouver. You could see that it was very kind of hermetic and stifling, and he's been an editor at Yishu magazine, which is the main magazine on contemporary Chinese art. For me, very inspiring in terms of what he did. Nancy Shaw, the late Nancy Shaw, she was part of the Cooney School of Writing in many ways. She was operated as a curator and a critic and a poet, an incredible poet. She had gone through communications as opposed to art history, so she really was trying to kind of challenge some of the orthodoxies of art and visual practices and curating, and in many ways inspired me to go try communications, but getting quite frustrated with how dismissive they were of the contemporary art world. But anyway, she was for me very important in terms of the work that I do. And then also Anthony Kendall. For me, he still operates as a curator and director in the prairies, mainly central Canada, and he's been at different institutions. But I think for me, I appreciated how he tried to do exhibitions that were very thoughtful in terms of engaging with ideas and with what was going on in terms of contemporary art. So he did a lot of key kind of group shows in my mind in the 90s and later. And also what he's done with many institutions that I won't get into right now in terms of building up, kind of strengthening some of their programming was an inspiration. And the fact that he, rather than move away to New York or LA, he really was kind of dedicated he saw the potential in Canada in these institutions and really seeing that they were kind of not really performing at the level that they could and trying to kind of build that up. And he's not alone, there's other curators and directors who have done some extraordinary work like that. But anyway, I just really respect that there's just there's some great work being done, but then there's also, there's a lot of real challenges when you compare a lot of the public art museums in Canada to Europe, or in some cases to the States. We just are not quite really doing the really innovative work that we should be and could be doing. And I really appreciate curators and directors who are able to kind of really push that. And it's hard. I mean, it's been hard to do that at Kamloops and in Surrey, and I've failed at trying to do that many times, but still I think it's important to kind of have role models there. I did a trip to the Netherlands, and I became quite interested in, I was invited to a conference at the ExhibitVic, and I mean, there was a time where every curator had a shaved head if you were male. I almost, I didn't go there. But the Eindhoven Museum, or the Van Abbe Museum, was a real revelation for me, and the work of Charles Esch, probably one of, for me, a real role model in terms of curating. What he was doing at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven was quite incredible in terms of exhibition making and really pushing things in different ways. I'll come back to that at the very end. So the Surrey Art Gallery, I mean, when I was offered a job at the Surrey Art Gallery, I just was thrilled to be able to kind of, come back to Vancouver, and because I really missed kind of having a really solid public library, because for me, libraries are critical to what curators do in terms of research. Also the Cinematheque, which I was a huge fan and participant in, not as much now that I have a baby, but for me, not returning to Vancouver Centre, but to be working in Surrey, which is just this incredible kind of boom town, an incredible place with many extraordinary people, was a thrill. But I also knew it would be a challenge. But I knew that there was a history there to the gallery in terms of programming that was inspiring, and knew that things could get done. So there's just an image of the gallery after the 2001 renovation. it's part of an art center, so it's a hybrid space, and this is what we tend to do in Canada, is we kind of jam-pack things together in many of our mid-sized cities and try to combine things. So the Kamloops Art Gallery is part of the library, and the Surrey Art Gallery is part of the art center. And in many ways it works well in some ways, but it is a real kind of handicap for any institution to build its identity when you're kind of part of a kind of complex. And that goes for the Barbican in London, which you may have been to, which is a kind of hybrid space where you have theater, cinema, various aspects, and the Barbican's always had a challenge in terms of promoting what it does. So it's not just a kind of Canadian problem by any means, but on the other hand, you have people who come to the theater who would never step into an art gallery, who walk into the art gallery and have a relationship to art and learn, and maybe it's a negative relationship, but maybe it's a positive one at some point as well. But the history of the Surrey Art Gallery was such that, I mean, one of the people who got mentioned a lot when I was sort of starting to curate was Jane Young, and she passed away in the late 80s, but she was a real force. She curated at the Surrey Art Gallery back through the 1980s and did shows like the Marion Hunter Bancroft and Stan Douglas exhibition, one of Stan's first exhibitions, and other exhibitions that really kind of pushed the envelope. So and other curators have done the same. And the interesting thing about the Surrey Art Gallery is it was formed by people in the community. It wasn't formed by kind of patriarchs who came together to share their collection with the public in a kind of paternalistic way. It really came from a group of citizens in the mid-70s who said, we want a contemporary art gallery, we want to showcase cutting-edge contemporary art. So it's really a pretty incredible story at a time when it was largely farmland. Art had been shown at the Centennial Art Center since the late 60s in kind of compromised ways, but by 1975 the gallery had sort of launched. So we're just actually coming up on our 40th anniversary. And I've been quite interested in the role of the suburb, or in French, the banlieue, the edge of the city as a site of a kind of where really the action was happening. So a lot of 19th century French landscape painters were very interested in the banlieue and the edge of the city as a kind of important site of modernity and transformation, and I was quite interested in what was happening in Paris today, and I recently had a chance to go to Paris and travel to many of the suburbs of the banlieue in Paris and meet with curators and museum directors and artists who were doing work on the edge of the city. And so I've been really interested in the idea of the edge of the metropolis as a kind of, not site of non-place, because there's a whole discourse in Vancouver art of the kind of defeatured landscape, the idea that the suburb is a kind of generic, space of entropy and decay, a backwater. For me, it really is it's the center. Like, it's actually where the interesting things are going on. But you gotta scratch beneath the surface in many ways in terms of, there's a kind of genericness that there's a kind of suburbs that we know in terms of signifiers and symbols. But I'm interested in how artists are kind of digging under that surface, and we've tried to showcase some of that at the gallery. So trying to bring different artists together in different ways. So here's a Victoria artist, Marianne Nicholson, and LA-based artist Etienne Zach, around sort of the idea of science and optics, treating them in very different ways. There's a better images of the Marianne Nicholson, but it was a kind of a piece responding to the oil sands and the impact on the north coast of BC and her traditional homeland of her family and ancestors. And so she created a piece where she did glazed glass sheets in the middle of the gallery and projected light from a kind of tower of different sort of spotlights. So the shadow of these figures that were based on some carvings that she found in the National Museum in Washington from her traditional territory that had been expropriated in the 1800s, projected onto this sort of landscape of the tar sands and the production of northern Alberta and BC. And so it was a very ghostly piece, and she uses light and etched glass a lot in her work, as probably some of you know. You're probably familiar with Marianne's work. in terms of responding to the suburbs and the space of the suburbs, this was a piece by Michael Markowski, an Alberta artist who spent many years in LA. Does a lot of work in terms of painting in motion. So he'll paint from sort of moving cars, on boats, on trains. Recently did a project in an F-16, drawing at high speeds. His goal is to go into outer space. But here he was interested in Old Yale Road, which is the old road that linked the interior and the gold rush to New Westminster. And this was a study that he did, I think with Matisse in the back of this truck. But he aboard this truck and traveled down Old Yale Road, painting the landscapes. David Horowitz, also interested in artists who are engaging with the kind of visual culture of the internet. This is a piece called Public Access, where he went to all the public access points up and down the California coast and photographed himself. It was part of a show we did on self-portraiture. But it was very much about public access in the sort of real lived space of these waterfront areas, but it was very much a kind of response to public access on the internet and how the sort of discourse of public access and the kind of utopia of the internet was in reality a very closed down and privatized space, and access was being winnowed back quite a bit. And so he created this sort of panoramic space within the gallery, using very kind of cheap materials, sort of photocopies related to the idea of hoardings, and how even in the city now it's very difficult. I don't know what it's like in Victoria, but to put up a public notice or a bill on a telephone pole or a hoarding, everything is so policed that this sort of public life of the city is sort of heavily policed in many ways. How am I doing for time?
Okay, it's almost an hour. Who came up with the installation concept for the David Horowitz?
We kind of came up with it together.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It almost feels like when you go into those public viewing places.
Yeah, it was very much about the idea of the sort of panorama, which was, before cinema was the place where people would go to look at foreign places, sort of scenes from the South Pacific or from India or something, and people would go and pay some money to go and walk into a kind of panorama to experience the travel through the panoramic form. So it was very much related to that sort of form of art consumption, and a very popular form for a short time. Well, actually for quite a while, and kind of came back in different ways. So the other thing that the Surrey Art Gallery kind of became known for was electronic media and digital art. And so we've tried to feature artists who are experimenting with media in different ways. Harun Farouki, the German filmmaker, created a work responding to the World Cup soccer match of 2007 about how surveillance and technology is fully integrated into our sports disciplines in many ways, not just through surveillance, but the way that bodies are regulated and tracked by coaches, monitored through technology. So he's very interested in, a lot of his work is about how technology and human life have become closely enmeshed in very oftentimes troubling ways. Brendan Lee Satish Tang, a Nanaimo born and raised artist, and Alex McLeod from Toronto created a kind of sculpture, sort of manga-inspired kind of sculptural ceramic shards, the way that you would kind of, in a way that's sort of like broken, you would see a broken vase in a kind of historical museum. And then Alex sort of creates these kind of digital animated video sequences that kind of became very integrated into the sculpture. So it became quite a kind of uncanny experience of viewing this object, but then when you looked over on the screen, you were part of the image, and the sculpture and the object had this strange relationship. So it's part of our Tech Lab program, and we try to feature artists who use digital technology in new ways. We also have a sound program called Open Sounds, and we feature a lot of artists who use sound in their practice primarily, and we do a conference every year called Sound Thinking. And it was part of before I got there in 2009, it was part of one thing that I noticed with the Surrey Art Gallery, which is different from Presentation House and different even from Kamloops, is that it has a strong tradition of really soliciting from the public what they want, and soliciting from artists, hey, what is not being done? How can we do better? And there's a real kind of engagement with what artists want and what the public wants. And that took a while for me to adjust to in many ways, because the presentation house largely kind of just sort of pushes forward, and it's created a very strong program, but it's not been as engaged with the public of the North Shore necessarily, where I grew up, and it's always, there's many people who feel that it's not properly addressing the local in many ways. So for me, what I like about the Surrey Art Gallery is that we have this commitment to the local, but also are showing international artists and regional artists, and really kind of have that triple focus. And it's been really inspiring and something that's been positive for me. And the other thing is with Surrey, it's a very diverse, culturally diverse and socioeconomically diverse community. And one of the sort of focal points that I've tried to work on and build on from my predecessors was to showcase Asian art especially, but not exclusively, and particularly South Asian art at the gallery. And so this is an exhibition that I curated with Naveen Gurn, a local curator, and we worked around sort of traditions of South Asian dance and music and performance. And so we invited emerging artists and showed them alongside more advanced and experienced artists like Jack Shadbolt. We borrowed from Vancouver Art Gallery Jack Shadbolt's India suite, for example. He traveled through India and Afghanistan and other places in South Asia in the 1970s, and created a series of works related to the temple architecture, and the figure of the dancer was very strong in these images. And then also working with, it's hard to see from this image, but this is a kind of cinematic device with images of a Bhangra dancer who worked with a collective of artists who work with dancers and visual arts, and really explore the kind of intersections between dance and visual art. There's many other works in that exhibition. This was an exhibition of contemporary sculpture from India that we partnered with the Vancouver Biennale on. Some really extraordinary artists who we would never have. It would be challenging for us to have we don't have the resources to ship much of this scale of work, and so it was a very interesting. It generated a very interesting dialogue and conversation around contemporary art from India, and also featuring Punjabi Sikh artists, because the South Asian population there, it's a lot of the same artists, many of them very good. But for me, I found it a little bit vacuous at times, and there's lots of exceptions, of course, but I just thought, I'm going to take this path and really try to kind of work here in Vancouver, but in a different way. And I love the artists who are doing that as well, whether it's in Nanaimo or Kelowna or wherever, and still kind of connected in with what's going on in Berlin or Beijing, but seeing that there's this really rich kind of environment here, and these histories that are so important to engage with in different ways.
I was going to ask you a question, but I think you've almost answered it, which is that when you describe Surrey, it sounds to me like it's a place that's more international and of the world than than Canadian. And but at the same time, because I'm not from Canada, and I was recently in the immigration office, and I was surrounded by other people who weren't from Canada, but they were all in Vancouver,
Yeah.
and it was wonderful. And so my question was whether you think that the work you're doing is Canadian in flavour or international in flavour. But it sounds like you're trying to kind of do both, or...
I mean, it is a very international place. It's incredible. It's even though city of Vancouver proper is a very culturally diverse place, it's many ways different in Surrey. There's parallels, but the challenge is that there's a kind of visibility and invisibility dialectic that's going on. You don't see people often because it's you still have this sort of the matrix of the suburban sprawl of people being dispersed into their cul-de-sacs and gated communities. There's change, now there's sort of densification happening, and it's starting to become a little bit of kind of pedestrian culture. People are largely hidden away from view. But I mean, you have, for example, a large Iraqi Christian community that's recently moved to Guildford in the last decade, and very vibrant community, and the Filipino community in Guildford as well is so dynamic. There's lots of arts events going on, and we're connecting with artists to try to showcase some of what's going on this summer. We're doing a show with a great painter from that community, but there's a kind of enclave-like kind of structures that happen that are both good and I think challenging in some ways, because what I noticed just and what some of the artists talk about is that if you're not part of the community, you're sort of maybe not aware of what's going on within the community, and so there's a lot of sort of separation. And I think what the role of institutions like the Surrey Art Gallery are, or theater spaces, or other types of spaces, is a kind of bridge where different communities can come together, and not in a kind of fluffy, warm, kind of celebratory way. Yes, celebration's great, but in a way that you can actually have some tough discussions around differences and expectations and sort of stereotypes and other things. And so that's what a gallery space should be, I think, about, is that kind of space of debate and conflict, and maybe sometimes some conflict resolution, but it's a space where there's maybe some difficult things that happen. And so there's some interesting, I think, in terms of some of the positives and negatives of Canadian multiculturalism are played out in the suburbs. And we have this traditional notion of the suburbs as a place of white flight, and in Vancouver, Metro Vancouver, and in many other parts of Canada, the suburbs are a very diverse, culturally diverse space of peoples and some incredible success stories, and what's going on is incredible. But you have this, like in Toronto, this conflict between the kind of suburbs and the downtown, and I see a lot of that starting to percolate a lot more in Vancouver, where you have Vancouverites, many of my friends and colleagues, who have these incredible sort of stereotypes about a Surrey person, or even people who grew up in Surrey who just will not go back because there's a kind of stigma about. So it's become a kind of, for many years, a kind of whipping post for fears, and a kind of space to project fears around difference, around class, around gender. There are a lot of jokes about Surrey women and sexuality, or increasingly about kind of space of the brown person, or the other, and this kind of there's this sort of unspoken kind of system of fear and speculation that I think sometimes manifests itself, and it's not just to Surrey, but about this relationship between Surrey and the downtown, or the suburbs and the downtown, and I think it's really troubling. And there's been some interesting writing. There's a book called Arrival Cities. Sorry, we're getting way over time. But it's about how these edge cities are spaces of arrival, and people are being alienated from the main population, and being kind of removed or sort of left out from the kind of public discourse around Canadian culture, or whatever it is. And
That's been happening in the UK for
Yeah.
a number of generations.
yeah, so this is kind of happening and going on, and class, very much so. Yeah. As you have a more affluent, and in Paris you see this as well, in terms of this sort of hatred of the suburbs, and a kind of people projecting their fears from the downtown of the suburbs, and people, and young people being alienated, and was talking to some young people in Paris, and who were just constantly being abused, being downtown and being non-white and not French, perceived to be not French, and this sort of, it's a real challenge. So I think, when I first got this job in Surrey, one of my teachers was like, "Oh, you're going to Surrey? You think you're going to do some good work?" And no, this is not a missionary project. This is not like, but it's. I think for me, it's just much more real and just interesting than working in a downtown sort of art environment all the time. And your idea of public is your friends. So I really think as much as in friendship is very important as a curator and artist, I'm much more interested as a curator in understanding the stranger, the person who's not your friend. Because there's a lot of, I think, there's a certain tendency of nepotism within the arts in general, and some of it is not, I think, nepotism, it's just real authentic friendships, but sometimes we don't go beyond our circles of networks. And I think it's really important to get outside of your network. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, sounds good.